Breaking the cycle to step forward. Authentic conversations from lived experience and a professional perspective in overcoming abuse with Chris and Beverley Ann.
Hello and welcome to Breaking the Cycle to Step Forward with myself, Beverley Ann, and my wonderful co-host.
Hi everyone, Chris here.
And we are really proud and so excited to welcome back John O'Brien, our very special guest for part 3. So if you've not listened to his other podcasts 1 and 2, please go back and revisit, because John's story is so interesting and everything he has to say keeps you riveted in your seat. So without much more delay, hello, John.
Morning. Nice to speaking to you again.
And you. And I'm going to pass over to Chris. Chris.
So I've obviously gone back over the past 2 podcasts that we did with John, which was one podcast which we stretched out and out and out, and we had to make it a part 1 and a part 2. So John, keeping you on track today. So in the previous podcast, we spoke about your life, your career. We spoke about the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and its importance. We talked about the launch day of the report when Liz Truss, the Prime Minister at the time, resigned. We shared the victim and survivor felt that their voice had been robbed on that day because of that incident. And you said something really profound in that particular podcast on that point. You said the report findings really needed to be driven down into the public consciousness, and that was robbed on that day because of the incidences of that day with Liz Truss resigning. And you also shared with us the importance of the Truth Project and the value that it added to the final report. You talked about the importance of the VSCP, the forum, the Truth participants, and the core participants. So we really shone a light on the importance of the victim and survivor's voice, adding value to not only the recommendations, but showing the history of child sexual abuse and exploitation and how important the research was to all of that. So we hopefully shared with everybody the bigger picture and the whole picture to that point. Now, you also shared about your journey being a facilitator and hearing about the actual honest, raw impact of child sexual abuse. And the story that stuck with you was that 82-year-old man. And it got Bev emotional on the day. I've heard it several times from you, and it always hits that raw nerve. And I'm hoping that many people will go back to those previous podcasts and really hear what you've had to say, because everything you shared, everything you spoke about are golden nuggets. And it really leads into where we are today and what we want to bring to the attention of everybody through this podcast. So the event that we held in Parliament just before the last government left, and we've now got a new government, was hosted by Jess Phillips, who's now a minister in this current Labour government. And how we're going to work with her going forward is going to be extremely important, and no one knows what that looks like at the moment. But the event was about reminding everybody about the importance of IICSA and its package of recommendations and what still needs to be done. Now, from a victim and survivor's perspective, and my voice is included in this as well as Bev's, since October 2022, when we published that report, the government was winding down. Another one has now taken over. It feels like IICSA was a waste of time. It feels like children are not important. It feels like child sexual abuse material and imagery has exploded and nothing is being done. It feels like offenders are getting away with really lenient sentences. Now, that's from our perspective. From your perspective, where you sit, How do you see the landscape since the release of the report in October 22?
So you've already indicated that the last government was, let's be honest, it was on a wind down. It was the signs that they were going to face difficulty whenever they called the election were quite apparent, being very honest, many months before they actually called the election. And as disappointing as it was for us all that they didn't really concentrate too much on IICSA recommendations. I want to come back to mandatory reporting just briefly, but they didn't concentrate too much on them. I always say that I never thought this would be a short journey. I always thought it would be a long journey, but long journeys are worth sticking with. And it wasn't only in this area that the government stopped doing things. I mean, they stopped doing most things. Let's be completely honest about that.
Yeah.
So we weren't selected as something that it wasn't worth doing. We were caught up in the general malaise that there wasn't much progress being made on anything. But we do now have a new government, and we don't just have a new government. We have, for the first time in 14 and a bit years, a new party in government with a very, very healthy majority. And I think that's very important for everything that governments might want to achieve. But in our case, looking at what we can do to stop this dreadful abuse of children, they're brimming with ideas. They've got to turn those ideas into policies, and then they've got to enact those policies, but they're brimming with ideas. They've got that healthy majority. They haven't got a past record from the last 14 years to live up to or down to. And I think that does give us all a golden opportunity to influence them about what needs to be done. Now, having said that, there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of people who want all sorts of things lobbying the government for those things to be done. So I always say we have to be very clear and very concise about what's most important to us. If we go with a shopping list of 100 things, we won't get them. So what's important to us? Why is it important? And how can we help the government to enact, to envisage, to understand those things so that they can get those, they can sign up to it and get those policies in place. And I have to say, at that event in Parliament, I was very encouraged by Jess Phillips' passion, because it did come across to me as she is very passionate about this subject matter. But if she watches this, I hope she won't mind me saying, any incoming government, that she has no ministerial experience. Lots of the incoming ministers won't have any ministerial experience because Labour haven't been in power for 14 years. So there'll be a learning curve to go on. And we must not assume that they know everything. And I don't say that in a horrible way, but we must help them understand, go back to basics a bit. Why is this important? What is the scale and nature of this? How does it happen? Where does it happen? And what are the things you can do to stop it? And we must just pause, I think, and recognise that that's the position that current ministers will be in. They're going to need our help, not just to tell them what needs to be done, but we need to take them back a couple of steps and make them understand why, how that can be done, and why, and what are the outcomes that we expect to see from it. Does that make sense? Because it's a learning curve. Everybody on this call and people that listen to this call are steeped in this subject matter, but they've come to it afresh. So I think there's a little bit of resetting, a little bit of working with government, not just to say to do IICSA, but to talk about child abuse and child sexual abuse and make them understand. I use the word epidemic. It is an epidemic.
Yeah.
And what do you need to do to stop abuse? Because we know that quite a significant proportion of child sexual abuse starts off as non-sexual abuse and then goes on later to become sexual abuse. So it's very important that we talk about abuse in generic terms as well as sexual abuse.
Yeah,
absolutely, John. And I think it's really, you said it really well there about recognizing where they are, but going back a little bit, not to detract, but when we're able to go back, break it down, then they're able to go forward and take action, because it's action rather than words that we all want to see.
Indeed. But I want to briefly touch on VORG. Because there's been lots of the government have said quite a lot. The new government have said quite a lot about VORG.
And what is it, John?
Violence against women and girls. They have said it's one of their priorities. They've got a target to see VORG halved in within 10 years, I think it is. So, and they're very clear on sentencing. And I was reading in the papers at the weekend, which you have to be careful about, but I suspect it's true that they want to make misogyny at the very extreme ends prosecuted in the same way as, as really serious.
Well, they want to call it out like terrorism, don't they, John? But
yeah.
what does that actually look like?
Well,
it's more what we all need to know.
It is, but yeah, absolutely right. So what does that lead to? But they clearly have an understanding that in any package where you're trying to prevent something, deterrence is a very important part.
Yeah.
And so what we've heard about at the moment is, they want to make it at the extreme end, like akin to terrorism. And that really is all about what happens to people that are caught at that extreme end. Well, they now know that that's how they're going to be dealt with. And there's some very severe sentencing guidelines around terrorism. If those are adopted for some of the things in VORG, I'm sure there will be a huge deterrence effect. Now, a deterrence is only one arm, but it's an important arm.
Yeah.
We read in the, just a couple of recent cases where there's been very light sentences for people caught with horrendous images of children on their computers and other electronic devices. And people reading that and thinking, well, I'll only get 2 years or whatever it was. It doesn't act as the deterrent that it needs to. And deterrence will never stop those people that are actually determined, but it will stop what I think are the vast majority of people that dip their toe in the water and then get sucked into it. That I truly believe that's how a lot of people end up being prolific offenders against children, is that they try it, whether it's online or something. And I'm not belittling that, but we need something that is a really sharp lesson for people that say, if I go down this road, this is the consequence I'm going to face, and make those people think. And the reason I say that is you need to shrink the pool of people. I think I've said this before. You need to shrink the pool of people so that you deter those people right at the earliest stage that are prepared to be deterred. And then you can focus the majority of your really heavy hitting resources on those people that won't be deterred. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Can I just pop in here, John? As also I look across all social media platforms, and I take some things with a pinch of salt, but where I see, like you did with the inquiry, you see repeating themes, I start really looking at that more closely and go, okay. So one of the things I've seen is where we have people that don't understand that what they're doing is an actual crime, and they actually say that. And to us that are in it and have been subject to it, we're like, how the hell can you not understand or recognize that what you're doing is a crime, whoever you are? So it's just like, do we need to do an awareness raising piece to make sure that every person in this country, whoever they are, truly gets this is a crime and you will get punished for it? So they can't wriggle out with that kind of, excuse.
But Chris, that you've taken the words out of my mouth, and John, there's been a couple of posts that I've been involved with, and I'm going to say the word shocking because it is shocking. The shall we just say esteemed presenter that's now waiting for sentencing. People around don't actually understand the severity of what he's done, but not only that, the impact. And I think with the stronger sentencing, it is another little step, as you spoke about earlier, to actually educating and raising awareness. Oh, that is severe, because here's the sentencing. Because quite frankly, the sentencing currently with any sexual abuse, it's disgusting. There's no other word for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in the reporting on the sentencing around people that took part in the riots after the events in Southport, that there's been more than a handful of people convicted of inciting on social media. And there was one particular report of a lady who clearly, genuinely, I believe, didn't understand that what she was writing, because she wasn't taking part in any physical activity at all to just didn't understand that the writing of horrendous things about what might be the cause of those riots was in itself a crime. And if you transport that back to the world we all operate in, you know, I do think there's a lot of people that don't understand that there is a line that you cross when it goes from when the, you know, let's take online, when the images you're looking at go from being, I'm looking at photos of my children on their holidays in swimming costumes, to now I'm doing something completely wrong. And people don't always realize they're crossing that line. We all assume that they do, but we have to recognize that some people don't. So you need two things. You need an education campaign that says, here is that line. And if you cross it, you also need these tough sentences that I'm talking about to say, and if you cross it, you do get much more than a smack across the wrist. Does that make sense? But one without the other is no good. Imprisoning people for 30 years is no good if they don't understand that they are now crossing that line where that is a possibility for them. So I think as people like me that are not survivors, but now understand much more about child sexual abuse than I did 10 years ago, but also survivors, I think it's our job to help with that education campaign, to keep giving out the message about where that line sits in an educational way, not in an accusatory way, but this is where it is. And then we need to work with government to say, having got that understanding much more embedded in people, you now need to help us to make the penalties for doing that severe enough that they act as deterrents from now that people understand it. Because if it is, you know, well, there's not much risk of me getting caught because there just aren't the police resources to follow up on these. And then if I do get caught, it's 6 months. That's not necessarily deterrent for quite a lot of people. So I think you need both. I think you need the education campaign to make people understand, particularly on online offending, where that line lies, and what is inappropriate behaviour, even if they don't cross the line, what is inappropriate behaviour online, and then work with government on the sentencing side. But we also need, it was interesting, Chris, you know, that, you know, it was IICSA a waste of time. When I'm talking with colleagues from IICSA, I always say, do not forget that of the Strand reports we issued as we went along, 83% of the recommendations were implemented. So I genuinely believe it was not a waste of time. But many of our most far-reaching recommendations we naturally saved for that final report. And we need to work to get those implemented and established. And, you know, my personal views on this is that, you know, if we can get a child protection agency and we can get mandatory reporting in, that would be an excellent start for this new government. I know there were 20 there, but I do think, you know, that it's a new government. They've got a big agenda they want to achieve. We've got to have that conversation with government and be happy that we can help prioritise the ones that we think are most important and help them understand how those can be set up and implemented properly. But I do think, you know, I have worked since I left IICSA with Alexis and others to talk to government, particularly about the Child Protection Agency, because you know in IICSA, when I talked about the Child Protection Agency, I talked about it very much in the light of the Health and Safety Executive.
Yeah,
I'm old enough to remember what workplaces could be like when health and safety was not even really a term that you applied in any sort of structured way, and the difference that the Health and Safety Executive has made from that, as much through education and helping as it is through enforcing, because I think that's really important, going into organisations and not criticising initially their lack of health and safety, but working with them to get it established and then criticise them if they don't do it.
Yeah.
I think that's why the CPA is so important. But most of all, because once you've got a CPA, you can start getting consistent national baseline standards across all organisations in all areas, with a proper regime of enforcement behind it that lifts people's understanding, lifts people's compliance, lifts organisations compliant, and doesn't give anywhere to hide where all of those things fail. So that's why I personally think the CPA is very important. But to work properly, it's not just got to be established, it's got to have the right staff in it, it's got to have the right funding. But so I've been working with Alexis and others to try and get that message across to government, because I just think it's just so important that we start working to get an organisation established that can do for child abuse and child sexual abuse what the Health and Safety Executive has done for workplace safety in this country.
But it's also important, John, isn't it, to, because you said in the last podcast that cultural change is going to take 10, 20 years or more, a generation. So if we don't start seeding it now and taking action, we're never going to grow this and change culture. But for me, it's more important that if this government are only in for 5 years, that the next government, whoever that may be, continues the work. So if we establish it now and we get that cross-party commitment, then it's going to just always be ongoing, growing, changing, making all of those amendments that is needed to better protect children, no matter who's in the leadership. So that is really crucial.
It is. I mean, once it's established, because, you know, my view is it should be what in technical terms is called an NDPA, a non-departmental public body, which is simply something that is set up and funded by government, but is independent of government. They have to operate within the remit that they're set up under, but in operating with that remit, they're independent. Once it's established, even if the government changes, they have to physically make a law to make it not exist. So once it's established, I really believe that it will prove its worth and people will want to work with it, including governments. It's the establishment that I think we need to get over. And so for me, you know, I will say quite honestly, if they do nothing else, if they do that, I think that'll be the most important thing they can do. I think it will lead to those cultural changes. I think it will lead to those operational changes. But I also think that the organisation itself over time will become the go-to organisation that starts to really make that cultural change embedded. So for me, it's the most important thing the government can do. You know, I think all of the other recommendations need to be done, but I'm sure if a CPA existed, they would be relaying that message to government on a regular basis. You know, we now need to do this and we now need to do this. And it would be an official voice helping to deliver that message consistently across electoral boundaries and across political boundaries as well.
And I think, John, that if we can get this across the line, all of us coming together, and we can talk about that a bit later on, what help we need further from victim and survivors and professionals in the sector, everyone, to get behind it as much as possible, it will truly show the victim and survivors who did come forwards, who did share their experience, that actually we are working towards what it is we promised them way back when, and that we haven't forgotten them. Because I've heavily on my conscience every night when I go to bed and every morning when I wake up is that we've not delivered what we promised, and it isn't through no fault of our own, and it is because we've got to work, we've got to take 2 steps backwards, 5 steps forwards, but our hands are tied. We can't force anyone to do this, but we are working away behind the scenes on social media. We're trying our best to really push this and explain why it's important. And I think when we can get it across the line in whatever way, shape or form we can, for me, it will be like we've delivered on the IICSA final report and all of those voices that were heard and not heard, and the people that have died and the people that are impacted and continue to be impacted. It will just, for me, bring me some peace.
I mean, I absolutely agree that, but I think, you know, sadly, I do think that if we take mandatory reporting as an example, I think the sad thing for me, and, you know, I'm going to be completely open and honest about this, was the number of different views that were coming forward from different survivor groups and different child protection groups about whether mandatory reporting should happen at all. And there was a variety of views on whether people agreed with it all. And if they did, what form it should take. And I think in all that we lost. Look, IICSA took 7 years of evidence on that. They arrived at a position. Just as my view was, just establish that position. And if you think it's wrong and it needs expanding or slightly contracting, do that later once it's set up, through learning, through experience of the introduction of it. But unfortunately, like all things, and I don't blame government for this, if they're hearing 50 or 500 different versions of what people want, it makes it really difficult for them to introduce it. And so on the CPA, you know, I do think it's incumbent on all of us to arrive at a position about what we think the CPA should do, what powers it have and what it should have and what it should look like, and say it consistently. Because if we get 30 different messages going to government about whether it's necessary, and if it is necessary, what it should do and what it shouldn't do, it won't happen. And that won't be the government's fault. It'll be because there won't be a consistency of what are you asking us to do. And you know, if you run a company repairing cars and somebody comes in and says, well, I think it might be the engine, but I think it might be the exhaust pipe, but it might be the brakes and it might be the sunroof, but I want you to do it for 200 quid. It won't happen. So we've to have a consistency. If it's actually the engine that we want, please, and we want it to do this, and we want it to perform like this, and if you go off and do that, we will be happy. And I just think what we've all got to do is recognize that consistency of message and consistency of approach is what's going to lead us at the end of the day to be successful in getting this. But you know, I keep saying it, if we see with the CPA what we saw with mandatory reporting, and I'm just being really honest about this, there were too many views, and they were neither right nor wrong. It was just recognizing that when you're trying to establish something, you need to come to a common understanding of what might work, and you refine it as you go along. You don't try and get to the finished article before you do it, because that will take another 10 years.
Yes.
You get to the point where you understand it enough, you know it's going in the right direction, you know it'll work. And then, you know, this is how a lot of these organizations that are set up work. They get set up, and as time goes on, they modernize, they do things in a different way, they move things online, but they do that after they're established.
Can I be a bit of a devil's advocate here? Do you not think, though, the government sending out consultation when, as you said last time, there was enough evidence, there was 8 years of evidence gathering, did they not ask for the waters to be muddied? Maybe not knowingly, but sending out then those consultations, asking for different people's advice on what it should look like, that muddied the waters. So they should have just cracked on with the recommendation and then did it like you've just suggested. So if they do that again, they're the ones asking, so therefore should they not do that this time?
So look, consultation is a common tool that government use to make sure that they've got a range of views. And I'm not saying everybody should say exactly the same thing, but everybody's saying, from a survivor perspective, and hopefully from most child support organisations, a CPA is absolutely necessary for these reasons, and those reasons are consistent. The details people can differ on slightly, you know, should it be an NDPB or an agency? We can all differ on that, but the consistency of message that we need it to have these powers, and we need it to be established in this way. But I don't think it's unfair of government to say, well, we just need to make sure there's consistency of views about that before we deliver it. And I do think it's incumbent on those of us that work in this world to come together and make sure that in generic terms, we have that consistent view. And what I'm talking about here is, you know, the big survivor organisations, the big child support organisations actually coming together in a way, discussing this, so that when they're approached, the feedback that they get from us is consistent. Obviously, members of the public can respond to consultations. They may have different views, but it will be very influential if we all talk at that really high strategic level with one voice.
Again, well, I'm being devil's advocate here. Sorry, Bev. We've got IICSA change makers that did just that, John. However, there was still very differing voices within IICSA change makers, and they were the big organisations and the groups of survivors. So what I'm saying is that already existed, and that is why mandatory reporting went the way it did. So what can be different this time to make sure that that doesn't happen? Because it is important that we don't repeat what has already happened.
And this is why I'm saying this, that government can't do anything to influence that. Only we can do that. Essentially, what happened with IICSA changemakers is there was no consistency of message that was fed back into the consultation. It was a complete mishmash of different views. If you go back to my garage analogy, is it the engine? Is it the exhaust? We all ought to know it's the engine. We all may have viewed it's the carburetor or maybe it's the spark plugs, but we should all be clear that it's
the engine.
And that's what we've got to be. So when they say, do you think a CPA is necessary? Everybody should be saying yes. Do you think it should have these broad powers? Yes. Of course, people are going to have different views. It would be strange if we all thought exactly identically about, it should have this exact remit and this exact number of staff. Of course, there'll be challenges and differences of opinion on that. But is it the engine? Should be consistent. And if you get that bit right, then you convince the government it's necessary, and then in the setting up of it, you take in account those range of views and you come to a compromise on that, how it's first established, and then over time through learning it then changes again. But if I go back to my analogy with mandatory reporting, not only did we not all agree it was the engine, some of us didn't even think you needed a car in the first place. So I just have to be honest, that is not a good way to influence government to do things. I'm not suggesting that every person that responds to the consultation will have the same view, but we should be working very hard to make sure that groups that represent significant numbers of people are clear whether they agree with this or not. And to do that, perhaps we need to do a little bit more, those of us that were steeped in why we thought it was necessary, to explain why it's necessary, what it will do, what it will prevent. But if they do a consultation, I'm not sure they will, but if they do, all I'm saying is there's got to be consistency about we need an engine, please.
We need a different approach when the time comes. We need to all sit around the table and thrash it out. Yeah, okay.
Some people think it should be a 1 litre engine. Some people think it should be a 9 litre engine, but everybody should agree it's an engine.
Should agree the concept, yeah.
John, I just have to say, listening to you, because obviously you two have experience together in areas that I don't have that actual experience, but I have the passion and interest. But I just love how you explain it. I'm the person outside listening in, and you're making it, so simple. And that's what you keep saying. And Chris is, really passionate about this, which is we all are. And I'm going to throw, the curveball in. Would you not consider heading up the CPA, John, please?
So that's a decision that's way above my pay grade. All I will say about the CPA is, it is very important that staff with the right experience get in there. I do believe it needs a mix of social workers. I think it needs, a range of skills on people that know how to deal with trauma, because initially at least they're going to come across a lot of trauma. But it also needs people that know how you run an organization efficiently and how you run an organization that influences. And they don't need to have those skills about understanding people. They just need to understand that they need people in the organization with those other skills. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Because it will need to talk to, passion is great, but when you're dealing with governments that have got a million things on their agenda, what they want is, succinct, powerful reasons and arguments about why they should say yes. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And the facts and the figures, John, as you know.
I think it needs a mix of skills. I think the first step is just to get the government to agree that they're going to do it. Yes. And if I was the government, I'd agree to do it. I'd agree what the broad powers are going to be. I probably would consult on things like, what sort of skill sets do you think ought to be in the organisation? Because I think it is important that we do that. It will end up being a compromise because there will be a range of views. But so long as the compromise is that range of views, everybody will feel they've been listened to. Everybody will feel they've had a chance to contribute to it. And that gives it a much greater success of having broad support. But I probably wouldn't, if anybody's listening on this, I probably wouldn't consult on should we have it.
Yeah. I'm going to make sure that this podcast is sent to Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, Jess Phillips, Sarah Champion, just as a starter, John, I will send it to them. Whether they watch it, listen to it, well, you know, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So that's my
yeah, I
comment
am.
on that.
I am genuinely encouraged by the passion that I've seen when I've heard Jess Phillips speak about
Oh,
it. I mean,
absolutely.
it is clearly a subject matter that's very close to her heart.
Yes.
You know, and you know, she does listen to it. I hope she doesn't take offence on my sort of inexperienced comment from earlier on. But all ministers will be inexperienced, and it's taking that passion and making sure it doesn't get derailed by the, you know, the treacle that trying to get any policy in government implemented means, and you know, using people like us to help wade through that treacle and help understand why this is so important, I think is what we can do. But I do think consultation is an important part of things, but I've made clear where I think the level of consultation on this should be. I think they should accept the concept personally and then consult on the next level of detail down.
But also,
Thank you, John.
I think it's really different from being the opposition to the person in power, because when you're the opposition, you can really call out the work of the party in power and the ministers, what they do, what they don't do. And when you actually switch from opposition calling people out to actually being the one now responsible for the doing and being accountable, I think it already, you can see the difference in how people are responding on social media, for example. And I get that you have to abide by different rules when you're in power as opposed to when you are not. So it's really interesting to see all of that unfold at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, when you're in government, you are governing.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And you can't do some of the things that you would do in opposition, because at the end of the day, you still have to govern. So I get that, you know, some of the things that any party does in opposition look like they don't happen in government. But what I would say is they're a new government, you know, from what I've seen, that, you know, on VORG and on the safety of children, there's a lot of passion, a lot of understanding, both by Jess Phillips and the Home Secretary, you know, who has vast experience in this area. I mean, she's been, you know, shadow, she's been chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee for a while. She has vast experience in this area. So I do see a lot of experience and understanding. Where the catching up will be is, you know, what has lain behind the policies that the government has adopted over the last 14 years. Why did they do it that way? They've obviously got to bring themselves up to speed on that to understand that before they decide whether they keep it, change it, or bin it. And that will take time. And they need to do it in a responsible way. And then, you know, inevitably in government, there is we want to do these 40 things, but we've only got money for 30. So which 30 are we going to do? And this will be put into that mix, undoubtedly, which is why let's have a consistent message from all the groups I've talked about, that it is the engine so important, because it makes it clear why and what it is that people are asking. And it makes it more likely, therefore, that it becomes one of the 30 rather than one of the 10 rejected ones. But we should never criticise, I don't think, that governments do have to govern and therefore they can't be opposition anymore.
Yeah, I'm just sort of like being devil's advocate and trying to bring to the conversation victims and survivors who have got in contact with me, who, you know, just are exasperated and frustrated and want their pain to be turned into something positive. That is why I'm questioning and trying to expand understanding and awareness.
So what we have to be honest about, none of that frustration or any of those other emotions that you've talked about were caused by this government.
No, true.
None of the policies that are underpinning those, given that, you know, we've had 14 years of a Conservative administration, would, you know, most of the policies that govern this area have been laid in that 14 years. So we do need to go back to what I said at the beginning, which is helping to explain, understand what the landscape has, how it's changed over the last 14 years for good and bad, so that we help them more rapidly get an understanding of what they'd like to do. But I don't think we should personally just go in and say, well, we've been telling you for, you know, the past 8 years of this, because we haven't. The honest truth is we haven't.
Yeah.
And being in opposition is different. You don't get all the briefing papers that government ministers get. You don't get all the expertise that exists within civil servants, that will come and talk to you about it if you want to. You enter government completely afresh and ignorant of all those things that have happened over the last 14 years from that perspective. Obviously not ignorant in generic terms.
Yeah.
But in those very particular terms, you don't have any understanding. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to help them get that understanding in this area as quickly as possible.
And I think it's really important, sorry, Bev, it's really important to hear what you're saying about all of this, because we do not have that knowledge that you have. So it's really good for us to have both sides of the conversation, so everyone can, including myself, calm down a little bit, give them a bit of grace, and then go, come on, you promised, let's get going.
If you imagine that, that the new government is a group of people that as a group collectively are working together for the first time, and they've just all gone to a strange hotel for one of those dreadful breaking the ice meetings, that's really where they're at. So they've got the passion, they know what they want to do, but what they need is all that background information from what's happened over the last 14 years, why the priorities are what they were, so that they can complete the circle of thinking about how they change it. And we just need to recognize that, it's not just a new job, because the agenda is now theirs to write, but you should never write an agenda until you understand the history of how you got to where you are. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It's that history of the last 14 years, not the basic knowledge, because they'll all have that, but it's the history of that last 14 years that's the missing link. And we should be a little bit patient, because I've been involved in preparing ministerial briefing packs for new governments, and they are huge. And of course, child abuse won't be the only briefing pack that Jess has received. She'll have several of them. So we just, I'm not trying to make excuses, but we do need to understand the challenges they'll be facing as new ministers and help them overcome those, rather than criticising them for not understanding it on day one.
Yeah.
And thank you, John. And another thought I will say, and we won't go off on this tangent, but in all fairness, I passionately believe, and I will say that word passion, because we need education within the media as well, not to use these headlines that incite people in the wrong way. We want informative, we want calm reporting, so people get knowledge. They're not just hyped up, and sadly then some of this messaging gets lost.
Yeah, because all you ever read is the headline. You don't read beyond the headline, because that's what winds you up. So I agree with that, absolutely. You need reporting where you read the whole thing, and so you understand a bit more than what the headline tells you.
Yeah.
Because the devil is always in the detail, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But one other thing I've done since I left is I've become a trustee of the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. And I promised myself that I was only going to become a trustee of one organisation, because I feel that it should be more than just turning up for 4 board meetings a year. So I wanted to become quite involved. And the reason I was so keen on Lucy Faithfull is Chris will know that in IICSA, I used to call child sexual abuse the last big taboo. It's the thing that people still don't like talking around down the pub and things.
Absolutely.
And Lucy Faithfull, I think, deals with the sharp end of it, which is working with perpetrators to try and stop them either reoffending, or in the case of its helpline, to try and stop people even crossing that line I talked about earlier. And I just think, like any sensible strategy to try and stop something needs to work from both ends. And I do think working, when you say I work with perpetrators, I have no sympathy for these people is a common response. Well, that ain't going to help, actually. You do have to accept that, look, there will be a hardcore that know exactly what they're doing and know exactly what they shouldn't be doing and doing it. But there is also, I've been surprised that since I, learning about the sorts of people where, that might be the wife phoning up, concerned that a husband might be looking at material he shouldn't. And then as a result of calling, there's then a call with the husband that explains to him why it's wrong, and he stops doing it. And that's, even if that's 1 in 100, and I suspect it's much more than that, but that's worth doing. So I really wanted to work with Lucy Faithful because I think they work at a very difficult end of stopping child sexual abuse. But I do think, working with perpetrators and stopping them offending or reoffending is important in itself, but it gives you an insight into why people start crossing this line, which will help when you go back to the more preventative things that we've just been talking about in this podcast. So, I was quite passionate about doing something in this area, but I wanted to do something slightly different from IICSA, which is why I went to Lucy Faithful, really, because we struggled in IICSA to really understand this from the perpetrator perspective. And I know that's really difficult, and I know people will say they deserve no sympathy, but if you don't understand why people do something, it's very hard to make them stop.
Absolutely. And I don't know about you, Chris, and John, hats off to you, and I always admire what you do and doing that. And I can't lie, that's not an area that I can go into. So I completely hear you and understand, and thank you, because it takes, special people to do all different kinds of roles within this field. And, well done, because I couldn't manage my emotions on that. And I have to be honest.
Yeah. And
so, yeah.
But what I should say is the enlightening thing about it is many people are only thinking of crossing the line and they reach out for help before they ever cross it.
Yeah.
So that helpline that they ring deals with many, many calls where people are worried that they're crossing the line, and they call before they ever get there. And how fantastic is that? So it is really important that we recognize that if all you ever do is lock people up and throw away the key, you're not dealing and more importantly, understanding the root causes of why people cross this line to start with. And we do have to start being more open as a country to understanding that, so that we can then take that learning back to prevent more people ever going there in the first place.
So I think Beverley touched upon it from a victim and survivor's point of view. They've harmed us, so we don't want to give any kind of recognition to them in any way, shape or form. However, with a calm, sensible, logical head, of course, we've got to look at the root cause and not the symptoms. Of course, we've got to be proactive and not reactive. And of course, we've got to look at the whole pathway, because that is what this whole thing is about. IICSA, the CPA, the preventative work, it's all part of the same jigsaw puzzle, whether we like it or not. It is. But we've also done a lot of work with Dr. Ellie Hansen, John, and she spoke about the challenge of adult porn being accessible to young children, and the part that is all playing in this whole jigsaw puzzle that we're talking about. It's like one aspect of it, but she's sort of like calling out the big tech companies, and that was one of the recommendations of IICSA, was to do the, stop the end-to-end encryption, to make sure the age verification was put in place, all of these kind of things. And this is the work that the VSCP have done with ARU and IPRI to bring a focus to all of that. But my point is, we are always just looking at one part. We've got to look at this bigger picture. We've got to look at the complete pathway, and we've got to deal with it from that perspective. So it's really important that we talk about all of this, John.
Yeah, I mean, that's why you need a CPA, because they will look at it from all those perspectives. Let's be honest. I mean, that's exactly why I think it's a brilliant idea to have an organisation that doesn't just look at one aspect, because you need a strategy that brings all those bits together. They'll have different interventions and you'll get different results, but you need one organisation across the piece looking at it, because then otherwise you get learning from one bit. We all know this from like serious case reviews in local authorities. Does a serious case review in, I'm just going to pick things at random, Cornwall, really lead to new learning in Northumberland? Sometimes, but mostly not. And so you need that you need the CPA in that national perspective, so it can help us understand all that. But the thing that really decided me on Lucy Faithful as the thing that I really hope to join was listening to those survivors through the Truth Project, because, you know, you sit there and you listen to how the abuse happened, you listen to the, you know, all the things about lack of controls and closing it down and things, and you think, actually, you know, I really understand the impact on the person, but where were the things that were going to prevent those people going there in the first place? And to me, that was the big missing link in all of this, is what are we doing to educate people where that line is and help them stop crossing it? And you know, I know it's a very emotive subject, but we do that, we provide that kind of help in all sorts of other areas, you know, stopping people stealing and all sorts of things. And we've just got to recognize that in any sensible policy, you said it, Chris, with a calm head on, you need that collaborative approach across the piece.
I think,
sorry, Bev.
I'm speaking here on, you know, my own views and my own feelings, which I think will represent some people. And I think the first thing that comes to mind is, and we see it all the time, if you're a survivor and you step forward, the first thing people want is evidence. And they want this, they want that, they want that. And if you can't provide that, you're not listened to, you're not heard, you're even not believed sometimes. Whereas often the perpetrator, and let's go for adult perpetrators, and being clear here, they just stand there and say, I didn't do it, they're lying, and they get believed. You know, I spoke about that esteemed, you know, presenter, and I use that word sarcastically. I will reiterate that one. But people listen to that person, and I think that's where, and I'll be completely honest, that's my challenge, because it's as if, like, I completely hear you and I do understand what you're saying, John, and we really need to do that. But as a survivor, I wouldn't want that balance to become out of balance. And that's the fear.
Let me be clear. I have no truck with people that deny it. The work that Lucy Faithful does is about people that are admitting it. Either they're thinking of crossing that line, or that they have crossed that line and now want help not to recross it. So I'm not even saying that where people have crossed the line, they shouldn't be punished. Of course they should be punished. But having been punished, surely it's in all our interest they don't go back and do it again.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm talking about. I am not talking about people just being able to deny they've done it and get away with it. I'm simply saying that in any coherent policy to stop child sexual abuse, we need to work with people who know they've got a problem, who have admitted they've got a problem and want help to solve it. People that haven't got a problem, that's why you need the real deterrents that I talked about, because there will be, and as there are in all crimes, a real hardcore people who know exactly what they're doing and think they're going to get away with it. Those are not the people I'm talking about. They don't reach out for help.
No. And thank you for that clarification, because that's important.
It is. It's very important. It's like all things, you know. It's like people that shoplift every day. If they shoplift every day and they get caught, they ought to get a really heavy penalty. If they shoplift once, get really guilty, go admit to it and ask for help, I think you should help them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bev, how are we doing on time?
We are actually, I can't believe you've asked. I've got 5 minutes left.
Okay, so let's spend this 5 minutes, John, in just allowing you to speak about whatever it is you want to speak about, your future work. You've done a little bit about that, but what people can do to maybe help with Act on IICSA going forwards and just driving this one message home.
So I'll assume I'm speaking to both groups and individual survivors. Engage with people on this call and others who can explain to them why IICSA arrived at the necessity for a CPA, what the CPA would do, and then be really clear that they agree, in my language, that it's the engine that we're all asking for. I know it seems a very simple thing, but if we can all agree on that, I think there's a real chance it will happen. If 3 people want a wheel, 1 people want the windscreen, other people want the windscreen wiper, you'll just end up with, well, let's go and do something where people do know what they want. So I just think it's really important we do not have a repeat. And I will say, I think part of the problem with mandatory reporting is there was no consistency amongst those of us who really wanted it and understood why it should happen. There was no consistency once it expanded out amongst those groups of what it should look like. And I think, Chris, you put your finger on it. You know, the sort of broader IICSA implementation group, as I call them, just had a variety of views. And so you imagine a government minister being faced with the group that are supposed to be the one that they talk to about implementing IICSA recommendations, and they get a variety of views. They leave feeling very confused. So I just think it's really important on this one. Not that we all agree on the detail.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a 3-litre engine, it could be a 1-litre engine. People have views, but let's please all agree that that's what we're asking for.
Okay. And is there any detail on how people can get involved, or will that be in a future podcast?
I think we should do that in a future podcast. And I say that not because we're out of time, but because actually I've said a lot today. I think there's always a lot to take in these things. And I think, you know, some people will listen to me and think I disagree with that. And I think we need time for people to disseminate this. And, you know, people will come back, and some people will be challenging. But I think if we give them time to think about that, then when we talk next time, then hopefully we can address some of those. Hopefully people will write to you with some of those, and we can address them in the next podcast.
Okay, John, thank you. That's lovely. Anything else you want to say?
No, I mean, I think this is great. As you know, I'd talk all day if I could, but I just think, you know, it's really important now that we stop talking about in generic terms. We're really specific about what we want to happen next. And we're not just specific about it, but we're prepared to work with government to help them make it happen. And that means recognizing that government need our help as much as we need theirs.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, John. Well, I was going to say, do you want the last thoughts? Because I'll include the email anyway. So do you want the last thoughts there, Chris?
I think I've shared my frustration, and John always brings me back into focus, like Faye Maxted, and calms me down and gets me back on the straight and narrow. So I'm going to leave it there, really, and I'm just really keen to get going and actually make this happen.
Well, I'm going to leave you with a thought. The best things in life are always worth fighting for, so you should never give up.
Oh, I never give up, John. It's just whether I run out of steam and I say the wrong thing at the wrong time. So I just need to rein myself in a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, we love your passion. And John, I can't thank you enough. It's so riveting speaking to you, you know, and, you know, I'm speechless from a good point of view because I'm taking it all in. Thank you, Chris, for your passion, because, you know, we need that. And
we need passion as well. We absolutely
do. And I think, you know, what you said about bringing different people to the table is so important, because we all have different ways of saying things, but the message we want has the same objective. And let's be honest, isn't that what the community is about as well? So it's a learning from each other. So thank you so much. Anyone listening today, if you want more information, you're going to see our email address below, or if you're watching on YouTube, and please contact Breaking the Cycle 2stepforward@gmail.com. We really do encourage your comments, because if we can hear what you're thinking, then we can respond. We won't always agree, we won't always have an answer, but it's good to hear your voice and what you have to say. Thank you very much, John. Look forward to the next podcast.
Thanks for the opportunity. Nice to speak to you again.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.